Good evening, everyone. We continue our study in the book of First Kings. Now, we completed chapter 6 in broad description, giving us an observer's imagery of the construction of the temple. Remember what I had mentioned last week was that when we are looking at the imagery of the temple, it is not giving us the blueprint, but rather the perspective as an observer, as somebody who is looking at the construction, what may be conjured in our minds. So it's more of an imagery, more rather than the blueprint. When we come to chapter 7, we are covering the first part of chapter 7, which is regarding the construction of the house of Solomon. And then later, tomorrow and the day after, we will be looking at the rest of the construction of the temple. Now, there are different things that need to be built. And so the text of First Kings 6 and 7 is very lengthy, and it gives us the imagery, particularly in the Hebrew, so that we are able to sit back and observe. That's all we are looking at. We're not looking at the blueprint details. We're looking at an artist's impression. So let's begin with chapter 7, verse 1. In chapter 7, verse 1, it begins this way. And Solomon built his own house uh, in 13 years, and he finished all of his house. And this is the summary. This is a summary of verses 2 to 12. So when we talk about his own house, this word is bait. This would mean it is a tent. It would mean that it's a home. And for the context that we are reading, it would really very much be his house. And in modern day context, we may call it his palace. And so when we read the summary of chapters 7, verses 2 to 12, these would be the buildings that we are told that is in this complex called his house. And it was built over a period of 13 years. And this, when you contrast to the previous chapter, the temple of God was built over a period of 7 years. More accurately, 7 years, 6 months. And what we're told right now is that it took much longer to build his own complex than to build God's house. He was actually pretty slow in doing this. That's the impression that we're getting. Almost double time, right? Almost double time. So you could see that the focus was very much in the house of the Lord. And his own house, it took some time. Now, that's all we are told in chapter 7, verse 1. Now, remember, we're talking about a summary, an artist's impression. It's just an imagery that we can see to appreciate what is there that he built. Now, we don't know exactly how it looks like, how the layout is, and this would be my impression. And I'm sure that if you were to go onto the internet, you get different views of it. Now, let me first explain to you Mount Moriah, where the Temple of Solomon was first built. Now, the temple would be built very much this way. The temple would be above, which we read, and more to come tomorrow and the day after in the rest of chapter 7. Then we are told of the complex of Solomon's house. And I would imagine the complex of Solomon's house would be somewhere below. And it is far bigger. Now, this complex is made up of a number of buildings. And so I would imagine, now, this is not the present day Temple Mount. This would be the ancient day where the Temple Mount was still very small, right? Much smaller. And you have seen, if you have been to the Temple Mount, there is a lot of reinforcement from the time of Herod, from the time of the Turkish Empire that came into the land and reconstructed much of the Temple Mount. Now, with this, I just want to give you that this would be the impression: east, west, north, south. Now, it is most likely, now again, I say most likely because we don't know for a fact, but some of the archaeologists would have found the palace of Solomon at the Ophel. And we have the city of David. Now, notice also that Solomon built his own house, and Solomon did not use the house of David that was built by King Hiram. And so this is a major departure, and Solomon built it in an even greater grandeur, in more specific dimensions, to give us a picture where his administration is focused on. Let's look at verse 2. So the text begins by saying he built the house. And this is the house of timber from Lebanon. Now, in many translations, you would say that this is the house of the forest of Lebanon, because that's the word for the translation here called timber. It would be the wood from Lebanon. So it's not wrong to say it's a house of timber from Lebanon. Now, Lebanon is actually north of Dan, north of the most northern territory of the Promised Land. But Lebanon is still within the confines of the rule of King Solomon, because it reached all the way to the Euphrates River. So now we say there is a house of timber used of the wood from Lebanon, and we read last week that they would cut the wood from Lebanon, bring it down in rafts to where King Solomon would want it, and they would move it from the coast to the inland. The dimensions that was given to us is this, that its length, the longer side was 100 cubits, the shorter side is 50 cubits, and its height was 30 cubits, on 4 rows of cedar pillars with cedar beams on the pillars. Now, this is the key, on the pillars. Now, again, I'm giving you an artist's impression, and it was paneled with cedar above the side chambers, which were on the 45 pillars, 15 in each row. Now, how would this work is that the construction would be this way. That's my interpretation. This would be 100 cubits. The width is 50 cubits. Maybe this is not long enough. 50 cubits. And we find there are pillars. Now, again, here the height is 30 cubits. The height is the same height as the temple, right? The height is the same height as the temple. Now, it says here on 4 rows of cedar pillars with cedar beams on the pillars. Now, I would imagine it would be very much this way, right? These were all pillars. And so there would be 4 rows of pillars. And so we would imagine it would be something like this. And then we find that on the 4 rows of cedar pillars, there are cedar beams on the pillars. And so what may happen, so that's my interpretation, would be things of this nature. So you have cedar beams going this way. And then you have paneled cedar above the side chambers were on the 45 pillars. Well, it's not on the 45 pillars as such. I guess you could say that, how should we say? In verse 3, 15 in each row, this will be on 45 pillars, and this would be done this way. This is one set, this is another set, and this is another set. And so we find that there are 45 pillars in this construction, lengthwise. And it is done in a way where it will, how should we say? It's to actually cover the floor. And so there is enough of them in this fashion with cedar above each side of the chambers, right? Now, this is the impression that I would get, and all done with cedar and at the height of 30 cubits. Let's continue to look at verse 4. Verse 4 tells us that, well, I would suggest that we would ignore all the italics, right? So we would read this. There were frames in 3 rows, and these frames literally means these would be window frames. Window frames in 3 rows, and window opposite window at 3 rows. This interval is 3 rows. Window here would be an opening. And so what we would see is that from a frontal view, there are pillars. And then there are 3 rows of windows. That would be the impression that we get. Three rows of them. On both sides as well. So we get it on this side and we get it on this side. And that would be what verse 4 would be describing to us. Verse 5. Verse 5 also tells us all the openings, right? These are openings. And I guess when you say openings, this would be the entrances. This would be the doorways. Doorposts had square frames. And window was opposite window at 3 rows. Which then tells us that there would be doors, right? We don't know where the openings are. Let's say this is one, this is one. The reason why we're not told, again, I have mentioned to you, we are getting an artist's impression description rather than the blueprint. And this is all we are told. And when we are looking at the palace complex, this is what we would see, right? This is the front view. Now, the next portion is something that we have to pay attention to. So let's take a look. Now, there are two verses that we need to pay attention. There is verse 6. He made, it says here, the hall of pillars, right? It says here, the hall of pillars. This really means the porch. The porch of pillars. Now, the idea of a porch of pillars would be that it's open. It's an open space where you have pillars around. And, well, we could say that this is a hall that could be a connection between the front hall, the building that is called the House of the Timber or the Forest of Lebanon, which is this one here. That's A. And then we have B, which is the Hall of Pillars. And C, we have here they call the Hall of the Throne. And we will get there shortly. So let's look at the Hall of Pillars or the porch of pillars. Its length was 50 cubits, its width 30 cubits, and a porch. And you could see that the confusion that we would have is that you find the word porch here. And this word porch is the same as this word hall. And so if you read the English, then we would think there is a hall of pillars, and then a porch is something different, right? The words are the same. So there was a porch in front of them and pillars, and the threshold was at the front. So let's take a look. It says, he made a porch of pillars, and then there was a porch before them, and pillars, thick beams before them. So this idea of in front is before. In front here is before. So what we would see, let me just remove this front view. Is that behind this, then again, I'm going to tell you this is my impression, 50 cubits by 30 cubits. So we have a 50 cubits by 30 cubits. Part of the complex, it was called the Hall of Pillars. And so they must have pillars, right? And it's built like a porch, which means that it is open. Its length was 50 cubits, width 30 cubits. Then another porch was in front of them, and pillars and a threshold before them. So I would imagine that there would be another porch in front, and we call this a threshold, right? A threshold means it's like a corridor, like a corridor. The next part here is that he made the hall of the throne. This is also called the porch. Porch of the seat. Hall of this porch of the seat where he was to judge. Now, this is important because this would be what we call the judgment seat. We are not given a dimension to it, but I would imagine that it would be somewhere here. And in this hall of judgment, or the porch of judgment, it was paneled with cedar from floor to floor. So this is all made of cedar wood paneling. And that is how I think we would be able to understand this. Now, further north would be the Temple of Solomon. And so here, let me just label them that we would be able to understand. This would be the Hall of Judgment. And this would be the throne, or the seat of judgment. That's where the focal point of the kingdom of Solomon would be. This would be the Hall of Pillars, right? The Hall of Pillars. And then here would be the threshold. And this would connect it to the two buildings. And this in itself will give us a picture to see that there is a grand building in front, A, a second building, B, and a third building, C. This would be what we call the house of forest, or the timber of Lebanon. And so now we have the description for three buildings in verses 2 to 7. Let us go on to verse 8 and 9. Now, let's do verse 8. Verse 8 says a lot in one verse. And it says here, and his house where he was to live. This is the key. The entire place is called the House of Solomon, but there is a dwelling place where he is actually dwelling, right? That he will dwell. That is this word, live. And it was there in the other court. Now, the other court would be inward from the hall, which tells us that it would be behind here. This is Solomon's house. And it was of the same workmanship, same construction. He also made a house like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had married. Now, where did he place that? I'm not quite sure. Maybe at the side, right? Maybe at the side. The idea here is this would be Pharaoh's daughter. What we see in these 8 verses so far is that Solomon's house description is behind his administration. Now, what are all these for? For holding guests, for holding judgment, and where he dwells. Now, obviously, he would have to have a large house. We don't know how big. Maybe this house would be huge because he had so many wives and concubines and even children. Maybe it was there, maybe it wasn't. And so we're not really told exactly how and where it's housed, and whether the number of wives and concubines were also an exaggeration of sorts to give us an idea that he just went ballistic in terms of building relationships. Understand, in the old days, when Solomon and Pharaoh's daughter got married, it was not a love story. It was very much in a way where you would have peace between two nations. Egypt is a mighty nation. Israel is also a mighty nation. And peace is achieved by extension of family, where Pharaoh's daughter was given in hand of marriage to King Solomon, which tells us then that King Solomon's influence was from the Euphrates River all the way down to Egypt because of this relationship. And it covered from west from the sea all the way to east beyond Syria. And so this whole picture is to give us the focus of um, Solomon's administration. And this is where I want to highlight to us. This part here is what I would call the focal point. When you read in other ancient books, when you talk about palaces, when you talk about places of dwelling, administration, you will never find actually the description of judgment. The reason why the hall of judgment or the porch of judgment was given prominence in the entire complex where Solomon lived is that Solomon recognized that it was the king's role to judge the nation. It was the king's role to sort things out for the people. It was the king's role to provide justice for the 12 tribes of Israel. It was his interpretation, and it was the right interpretation, to represent God where God is just to the people. And that was why when Solomon asked for knowledge, for understanding, for wisdom, it was the keen insight, the ability for Solomon to understand things, know things, see things, analyze things, and he had the understanding, knowledge, and eventually the experience, but the keen insight to give very good and just judgment. And so the whole of judgment gives us the picture that Solomon would spend a lot of his time in this aspect to show the people that as their king, he represents the justice of God to his people. And that was why God was so happy to give him the ability of wisdom, of insight, of knowledge. He knew so much so that when he looked at situations and cases and problems, he would have no problem coming to terms to advise them, to judge them, to provide analysis, to determine the truth of things, to sort out the good and evil between cases. Now, with this, 8 verses, you would find that it gives us the character of King Solomon's administration, right? In verse 9, then it tells us that all of these were of valuable stones, precious stones, according to the stone cut according to measure. There is what we call a standard, right? A standard measurement. And they were hewn stones. These were what we mean the way that they cut both inside and outside from the foundation of the coping, the foundation of the what we call the span, uh the actual span of the foundation. I think that you'll be able to tell the entire foundation the span of the foundation. I think that would be a way of explaining it, the span. And from the outside to the large courtyard. And so there would be a courtyard that we have to then put in place. And the courtyard would be or should be all around, right? Should be all around. And so we are told that there are precious stones, there are uh, foundation stones, and which means that this whole place were made to last. Foundation stones are very important so that the foundation can be reused in time to come to build more. And the foundation was of valuable stones, large stones, stones of 10 cubits and stones of 8 cubits, which tells us that these are big stones, whole to make the foundation. And these were valuable stones. Above the valuable stones, they were cut according to measure, and they put the cedar on top. So if you think of it this way, the flooring were all of stones, and this would be a foundation of solid stone, and then you would put the cedar pillars on top. And so you find that this would be lasting for a long, long time. So that's the impression that we would get, I would say, the impression of how the entire construction was actually made. It says here the large courtyard all around had 3 rows of cut stone and a row of cedar beams, as well as the inner courtyard of the house of the Lord, the porch of the house. Now remember, we talked about this in chapter 6. Cut stones in 3 rows. This is about the wall. And then you have a row of cedar wood. Right? This is how it's done at the walls of the porch, the walls of the courtyard around the Solomon's palace, however big that may be, we're not told. And it connects to the inner courtyard of the house of the Lord. So what we could actually see is if this was the complex of Solomon, then it would join up to the complex of God's house, the outer courtyard all round. So that would be something that we can imagine it to be. So this would be a huge complex, right? A huge complex. Now we come to the last 2 verses for today, verse 13. Verse 13 tells us that King Solomon had sent to fetch someone from Tyre. So King Solomon sent and had Hiram brought from Tyre. Now we know that Hiram in Second Chronicles, his name was Huram. Now these are just sound changes, nothing to be apprehensive, but basically we know that this is not King Hiram, right? This is not King Hiram. King Hiram, and again, one of the nice things that we read in the Bible is that when names are nice, people reuse them all the time. So King Solomon sent and definitely had Hiram brought from Tyre. So this Hiram had a background. He was the son of a widow from the tribe of Naphtali, which means that he had a mother who was an Israelite. His father was a man of Tyre, an artisan in bronze. He worked with bronze component, but he had died. That's why he says that he was a widow's son. The father had died. Now, look at these statements. He was a skilled artisan. He was filled with wisdom, skill, and knowledge for doing any work in bronze. And this idea, he was filled. It means that he was full, right? He was full with wisdom, skill, and knowledge. This idea of wisdom, skill, and knowledge is very much the same elements as King Solomon. But in his case, in Hiram or Huram's case, this aspect of wisdom, skill, and knowledge was to work with bronze components. In the case of Solomon, his wisdom, skill, and knowledge was in the purpose of judgment, ruling the people. And so we must see that this is not wisdom in all sorts and all things. There is a context when wisdom, skill, and knowledge is used. And in the case of Hiram or Huram, he was able to deal with bronze. Now, understand that this word bronze being used here, it is also equivalent to the idea of copper. So whenever we see the word bronze, we could read it as copper. So he understands how to do all the works of copper. And so he came to King Solomon and he did all his work, which we will read from verse 15 onwards. The work of Hiram or Huram, using bronze, using his wisdom, skill, and knowledge for work of bronze, was also brought to bear in the utensils and instruments of the temple of God. And so we will end here for today. And tomorrow we will look at more description of the things that is being made with copper or bronze, depending on the translation you use. And these is done by Hiram right here from Tyre. And with this, we come to the end of our session today.